3 November 1944, east of Luzon, Philippine Sea. Japanese submarine I-41 fired 2 torpedoes into the light cruiser USS Reno while she screened Task Force 38 east of the San Bernardino Strait. One was a dud, the other detonated deep on the port side, killing 46 sailors, flooding machinery spaces, and leaving the ship powerless and listing. Reno would eventually be towed more than 1,500 miles to Ulithi before she could steam under her own power again. The official Bureau of Ships War Damage Report noted that survival depended on portable electric submersible pumps, supplemented by new P500 gasoline-driven pumps and additional capacity from the fleet tug. One sentence summed up the lesson. The portable electric submersible pump has proved invaluable in controlling flooding in damaged ships. Reno was only one case. Dozens of U.S. warships in the Pacific avoided sinking because damage control petty officers cross-connected firemains and rerouted pumps in ways designers had not anticipated. The question is, how much of the Pacific War was decided at those manifolds and valves? 1st September 1939. Navy Department, Washington, D.C. Staff officers in the Bureau of Construction and Repair reviewed peacetime damage control instructions that still assumed limited aerial torpedo threats and relatively modest underwater damage. Manuals concentrated on compartmentation, fixed pumps, and conventional firefighting drill. The building itself felt like the peacetime Navy. Orderly desks, typed memoranda, theoretical calculations about watertight subdivision. Pre-war doctrine expected that careful watertight subdivision and a small number of large installed pumps would keep a damaged ship afloat. The assumption was simple. A battleship or cruiser would absorb 1, perhaps 2 torpedo hits. Watertight doors would close. Main fire and bilge pumps, backed by auxiliary units, would handle the flooding. The Firemain, a pressurized network of pipes feeding hydrants and sprinklers, would remain intact enough to fight fires and supply adductors for dewatering. Reality would prove different. Wartime experience would show repeated cases where flooding spread via piping and cable runs into compartments that were theoretically safe. A ruptured Firemain could deprive entire sections of firefighting water. Unvalved auxiliary lines could become conduits for progressive flooding, defeating even well-subdivided hulls. The Bureau of Construction and Repair, soon renamed Bureau of Ships in 1940, became the central authority for damage control doctrine and design changes. Its engineers studied translated foreign manuals, including Imperial German Navy instructions from the previous war, looking for lessons about underwater damage. What they found was a framework built on the assumption that battles would resemble Jutland. Shell hits above the waterline, some flooding, but ships generally remaining stable and under power. Pre-war capital ships and cruisers relied on main fire and bilge pumps, auxiliary pumps, and a firemain arranged in as few sections as practical trading survivability against weight and complexity. Portable pumps existed mainly as small handy-billies, typically 60-gallon-per-minute gasoline-driven units intended to supplement installed systems. These were considered auxiliary equipment, backup tools for minor leaks or firefighting in spaces the main system could not reach. The later Handbook of Damage Control would summarize the shift bluntly. Since the first days of World War II, the great importance of damage control has been clearly perceived. That sentence, written after years of combat, was an implicit admission. Before Pearl Harbor, damage control was theory. After Pearl Harbor, it became survival. The limited pre-war focus on portable dewatering and firemain sectionalization set the stage for heavy early losses and, in turn, for rapid wartime innovation in pumps and piping. Engineers in Washington could not yet know that within 3 years, the Navy would issue handbooks describing damage control as the accumulated damage control experiences of the present war. They did not know that combat would render their careful peacetime assumptions obsolete within months, but the framework was in place. The Bureau existed, The reporting structure existed. When war came, the institutional machinery would be ready to collect data, analyze failures, and push changes into fleet doctrine faster than any Navy had managed before. The question was what those changes would cost in ships and lives before the lessons were learned. 7 December 1941. Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii. As smoke still hung over Battleship Row, initial damage reports and stability calculations began flowing from Pearl Harbor to Washington. The scale of underwater damage exceeded every pre-war planning assumption. Ships that were supposed to survive were sinking. Ships that were supposed to remain stable were capsizing. The neat theoretical calculations about compartmentation and pump capacity were being rewritten in oil and seawater. Pre-war battleship design had emphasized armor and internal subdivision. Commanders expected ships to remain stable after 1 or 2 torpedo hits. The plans showed watertight compartments, redundant pumping systems, and carefully calculated flooding scenarios. On paper, the ships were survivable. At Pearl Harbor, multiple torpedo and bomb hits on ships such as USS Arizona, West Virginia, and California demonstrated that progressive flooding, firemain ruptures, and loss of power could overwhelm even heavily compartmented hulls. Arizona exploded and sank almost immediately. West Virginia settled on the bottom, kept upright only by counterflooding that her damage control officer ordered before power failed. California flooded slowly through ruptured piping and unvalved cable trunks, systems that were theoretically isolated but proved to be connected in practice. The Pearl Harbor Salvage Division and Bureau of Ships Engineers began to compile case histories that would later feed the War Damage Report series. These were not abstract studies. They were forensic investigations of failure, tracing water paths through hulls that were supposed to keep it out. Salvage and dewatering at Pearl Harbor involved a mixture of ship's pumps, pumps from tugs and yardcraft, and improvised portable equipment. Teams worked for months to lower water levels in sunken battleships, building cofferdams around damaged sections, patching holes, and running pumps continuously. Early memoranda highlighted problems with access to flooded spaces, insufficient portable pump capacity, and difficulties with oil-contaminated water. The Navy's small gasoline handy-billies, adequate for peacetime fire drills, were marginal for sustained combat salvage. The Bureau of Ships would later note that the war damage reports formed one of a series of 62 war damage reports prepared by the Bureau covering damage received in action by vessels of the U.S. Navy during World War II. Each report was a lesson written in steel and casualties. Each one documented what worked, what failed, and what needed to change. Pearl Harbor's salvage campaigns generated the first systematic evidence that portable pumping and flexible piping arrangements were as decisive as armor thickness. A battleship could have 14-inch armor and perfect compartmentation, but if her pumps lost power and her firemain ruptured, she would sink. The question became how to design systems that could survive battle damage and how to train crews to use them under fire. Even before 1942 ended, cruiser actions in the Solomons would show that ships with comparable structural damage could have radically different fates depending on their ability to control flooding and restore firemain pressure. The difference between survival and loss would come down to valves, pumps, and the sailors who operated them. Pearl Harbor proved the problem existed. The Solomons would show the solution. 1st May, 1943. Damage Control School, U.S. East Coast. At a wartime damage control school, instructors stood beside a mock-up of a flooded compartment with cut piping and simulated hull breaches, using recent combat cases as teaching material. Water sprayed through holes in sheet metal bulkheads. Sailors in dungarees wrestled with portable pumps, rigging discharge hoses, and running power cables across wet decks. The instructors shouted over the noise of pumps and rushing water, explaining how USS Boise had kept 20 submersible pumps running after Cape Esperance, how Salt Lake City had dewatered forward spaces in the Bering Sea using bucket brigades. Before the war, damage control had been a collateral duty, something handled by whoever was nearest when something broke. By 1943, the Navy was treating it as a specialty with formal schooling and standard equipment lists. The change was institutional and fundamental. The newly formed Bureau of Ships coordinated with fleet commands to collect lessons learned from every engagement. Reports came back from the Pacific describing flooding patterns, pump performance, and piping failures. These reports were stripped of operational details and turned into training material. Every mistake, every success, every improvised solution became part of the curriculum. The Naval Damage Control Training Center and fleet schools adopted Bureau of Ships reports as core curricula. Sailors learned to read piping diagrams, calculate flooding rates, and rig pumps under pressure. They practiced on realistic mock-ups that simulated battle damage, ruptured pipes, jammed valves, flooded compartments with limited access. The training was as close to combat conditions as peacetime facilities could provide. The Navy introduced standardized portable electric submersible pumps designed to operate underwater and dewater spaces without installed drainage. These were not the small gasoline handybillies of the pre-war era. They were purpose-built pumps with 25-foot and later 50-foot heads capable of lifting water from deep compartments to main deck discharge points. They could run submerged, tolerate oil-contaminated water, and operate continuously for hours. Gasoline-driven salvage pumps were consolidated into higher capacity types such as the P500, rated at 500 gallons per minute. These larger pumps could handle major flooding or supplement ship systems when installed pumps lost power. They required more fuel and maintenance than electric units, but provided critical capacity when electrical power failed. The handbook written from these experiences described itself as intended to serve as a textbook in damage control schools and to provide a ready source of information and guidance for the forces afloat. It was a manual built on failure and survival, every page paid for in combat. Institutional recognition of damage control as a profession made it possible for petty officers to take aggressive initiative with pumps and valves in action. Before the war, cross-connecting Firemain sections or running pumps in unconventional configurations would have been seen as dangerous improvisation. By 1943, it was Doctrine. Damage control petty officers had the authority and training to reconfigure systems under fire, an element that would determine whether heavily damaged cruisers and carriers survived. Within months, a single U.S. light cruiser would control catastrophic flooding using 20 portable submersible pumps, showing how far Doctrine had moved from the pre-war model. The question was no longer whether portable pumps worked, but whether the fleet had enough of them. 26 March 1943. Near the Komandorsky Islands, Bering Sea. After the Battle of the Komandorsky Islands, heavy cruiser USS Salt Lake City lay low in the water in subarctic conditions, with damage control logs documenting flooding and leakage patterns. The engagement had been a running gun battle against Japanese cruisers in freezing fog. Salt Lake City had taken shell hits that flooded forward spaces and damaged her propulsion. Now she drifted in heavy seas while damage control parties fought to keep her afloat. Designers had expected cold water to slow flooding and provide some stability. The theory was that frigid temperatures would reduce crew fatigue less than tropical heat, and that cold seawater would be less corrosive than warm. In practice, oil-water mixtures and low temperatures complicated both pumping and shoring. Damage control officers recorded that forward compartments had to be dewatered, using a combination of portable submersible pumps and manual bucket lines over several days. The early 25-foot head submersible pumps proved marginal when discharging to high freeboards or dealing with viscous oil-water mixtures. Strainers clogged. Electric cables, stiffened by cold, cracked when bent around damage. Sailors worked in near-freezing water, passing buckets hand to hand when pumps could not keep up. The ship's main fire and bilge pumps had to be protected from further damage, limiting reliance on installed systems. Power distribution was precarious. Any additional flooding could disable the remaining generators. Portable pumps became the primary dewatering method, but they were barely adequate for the task. Later summaries noted that in similar destroyer cases, portable electrical submersible pumps and 60-gallon-per-minute gasoline handybillies were used in dewatering operations prior to the arrival of heavy salvage units. Salt Lake City proved the same pattern. Without portable equipment, she would have sunk before help arrived. With it, she barely survived. The extended, marginally successful dewatering in the North Pacific campaigns demonstrated the need for a greater pump head, better strainers, and more robust portable equipment. Bureau of Ships procurement decisions in 1943 and 44 reflected these lessons. Pump allowances increased. Specifications called for improved cold weather performance. Training emphasized rapid deployment and redundant rigging. Salt Lake City limped to port under her own power after days of continuous pumping. Her survival was counted a success, but it highlighted limitations. If dewatering required days of manual labor and marginal pump performance, the fleet could not sustain heavy combat in forward areas. Ships needed better equipment and more of it. The next time a cruiser survived massive flooding, it would not take days and bucket brigades. It would take a matrix of standardized pumps deployed according to new doctrine, with trained petty officers who knew how to rig them faster than the sea could rise. Salt Lake City showed what could be done with determination and improvisation. The cases to come would show what could be done with proper equipment and training. 11 through 15, October 1942. Esperance area after the Battle of Cape Esperance. Damage reports from USS Boise, hit hard during the night engagement, crossed desks at Bureau of Ships with annotated sketches of flooded compartments and pump locations. The battle had been a confused night action off Guadalcanal, radar-directed gunfire in darkness, Japanese and American cruisers trading salvos at close range. Boise had taken multiple shell hits in her forward magazines and machinery spaces. Gunfire damage had been expected to cause primarily above-water fires and blast. Pre-war damage studies focused on shell penetration, armor effectiveness, and fire control. In practice, shell hits triggered complex flooding and internal ruptures that demanded aggressive dewatering far beyond pre-war plans. A single 8-inch shell penetrating below the waterline could flood multiple compartments if piping or watertight integrity failed. The War Damage Report number 24 on Boise noted the methods used to control flooding after battle. The language was technical and precise, but the numbers were striking. Dewatering was accomplished by the use of 20 portable, submersible pumps rigged to discharge topside, an explicit numerical measure of portable pump dependence. 20 pumps, not 2 or 3 backup units, 20 separate electric submersible pumps, each requiring power cables, discharge hoses, and continuous monitoring. Power cables had to be led across damaged zones, routed around destroyed compartments and severed mains. Discharges were routed through intact hatches and scuttles to maintain trim, with pump locations adjusted as flooding boundaries shifted. Boise's War Damage Report became one of the earliest widely circulated examples of large-scale portable pump employment on a major combatant. Bureau of Ships distributed copies to fleet commands, training centers, and design sections. The report was studied, annotated, and incorporated into doctrine. The lesson was clear. Installed systems were primary, but portable capacity determined survival. The success of Boise's dewatering persuaded Bureau of Ships and the fleet to increase authorized numbers of portable pumps and to stress rapid rigging drills in training syllabi. Ship allowances were revised. Design specifications for new construction included provisions for storing and deploying larger numbers of portable pumps. Training mock-ups were built to replicate the conditions Boise's crew had faced: multiple flooded spaces, damaged electrical systems, and the need to rig pumps quickly under fire. Boise survived and returned to service. Her forward magazines were repaired, her damaged compartments restored. She would fight again in the Philippines, her survival at Cape Esperance a proof that aggressive damage control could overcome what pre-war planners had considered fatal damage. The question was whether the fleet could replicate that success consistently across dozens of ships and hundreds of engagements. Within 2 years, Bureau of Ships would recommend that cruisers like Reno carry 8 electric submersible pumps and 4 P500 gasoline pumps as standard equipment. Boise's 20 pumps, gathered from across the ship and possibly from other vessels, would become the baseline for normal allowances. What had been extraordinary improvisation in 1942 would be standard procedure by 1944. 30 November 1942. Off Tassafaronga, Solomon Islands. After the Battle of Tassafaronga, heavy cruisers USS Minneapolis and USS New Orleans limped away with their bows shattered. Similar cases such as USS Chester showed up in Bureau of Ships' structural repair studies. The battle had been another night engagement, Japanese destroyers launching long-lance torpedoes with devastating effect. American cruisers, caught by surprise, absorbed multiple hits. Torpedo defense schematics had anticipated localized flooding, damage contained by watertight bulkheads and torpedo defense systems. The neat diagrams showed blast effects dissipating into void spaces, structural bulkheads holding and flooding limited to a few compartments. In reality, structural damage extended over tens of feet, with bottom structure seriously damaged over an area 32 feet long on one cruiser and immediate flooding of machinery spaces on another. Bureau of Ships engineers produced the study Structural Repairs in Forward Areas During World War II, using photographs and field reports to illustrate the actual path of flooding and repairs. The photographs showed bows sheared off, structural frames bent and twisted, shell plating torn away in jagged edges. These were not the clean, theoretical damage patterns of pre-war studies. They were catastrophic structural failures. Reports described engine rooms that flooded immediately through a 10-inch diameter hole in the shell plating, defeating watertight doors and bulkheads through piping and cable penetrations. Water followed every cable trunk, every ventilation duct, every unvalved auxiliary line. Compartments that were theoretically isolated proved to be hydraulically connected through systems the designers had not considered vulnerable. Portable pumps and improvised patches kept drafts within acceptable margins until temporary bow structures and shell repairs could be installed. Damage control parties rigged pumps in flooded spaces, running discharge lines topside and monitoring water levels continuously. Carpenters built wooden collision bulkheads behind the damaged areas, shoring them with timber and steel. Welders cut away torn plating and fabricated patches from whatever material was available. The report showed that forward repair bases could carry out temporary structural repairs to torpedo damage, sufficient to send cruisers back to U.S. yards under their own power. Minneapolis received a temporary bow at Espiritu Santo, a welded structure that allowed her to steam at reduced speed. She crossed the Pacific to California, where permanent repairs restored her to full capability. The temporary bow was proof that forward repair capabilities could turn potential losses into temporary casualties. Real damage patterns forced a reevaluation of Firemain runs, penetration standards, and the distribution of portable pumping equipment between forward and after repair parties. Bureau of Ships issued technical bulletins recommending design changes, additional cutout valves in piping runs, improved cable trunk sealing, and relocated pump storage to ensure access after damage. The emerging lesson was that controlling flooding was less about any single compartment and more about understanding the entire pipe and pump network as a system. Every valve, every cross-connection, every portable pump location mattered. Damage control was not about stopping water at bulkheads. It was about managing water flow through the entire ship, rerouting it, pumping it, and keeping it away from critical spaces until repair could be made. 15 August 1943. Drafting Room, Bureau of Ships, Washington, D.C. A working group reviewed drafts that would eventually appear as the 1945 Handbook of Damage Control, known as NAVPERS 16191, integrating field experience into formal doctrine. The room was heavy with cigarette smoke and technical drawings. Engineers and former fleet officers debated wording, arguing over how to translate combat experience into procedures that could be taught. Pre-war firemains had been arranged as relatively continuous loops, efficient for normal operations, but vulnerable in combat. The theory was that a loop provided redundancy. If one section failed, water could reach any point from another direction. Wartime damage showed that a single rupture could disable large sections of the ship's firefighting and dewatering capability. A shell or torpedo hit that breached the firemain could deprive entire zones of water pressure, making firefighting impossible and crippling adductors needed for dewatering. Bureau of Ships Damage Control section incorporated combat feedback into textbook chapters. Future officers and petty officers would be trained from this material, learning not just peacetime procedures, but battle-tested doctrine built on actual casualties. The handbook specified that during battle, the firemain must be segregated into a number of separate and independent firemain systems. This was a fundamental change in operational philosophy. Instead of a continuous loop, the firemain would be divided into sections that could be isolated from each other. Each section would have its own pumps, its own valves, and its own discharge points. The handbook explained how cutout valves and cross-connections allowed surviving sections to be reconfigured to supply sprinklers, hydrants, and adductors around damaged areas. If a torpedo ruptured the forward firemain, valves could isolate that section, while cross-connections allowed after-pumps to supply forward firefighting equipment through intact piping runs. The system became modular, adaptable, survivable. The same chapter stressed that each section must have its own source of water and be capable of being operated as an individual system without detriment to the ship's battle efficiency. This requirement drove pump placement, valve spacing, and piping routing on new construction. It also drove retrofit programs on existing ships, adding valves and cross-connections to hulls that had been designed under pre-war assumptions. Formalizing sectionalization and cross-connection procedures gave damage control petty officers doctrinal backing to isolate ruptures and feed pumps in unconventional patterns. Before 1943, cross-connecting firemain sections in ways not specified in the ship's plans would have been seen as dangerous freelancing. After 1943, it was expected. The handbook legitimized aggressive improvisation, giving petty officers the authority to reconfigure systems based on damage conditions rather than peacetime diagrams. This was exactly the reckless reroute that would later save ships like Reno, closing valves here, opening cross-connections there, feeding pumps from unexpected sources, and discharging through unconventional routes. The doctrine gave structure to improvisation, making survival techniques teachable and repeatable. The next step was making sure the fleet could actually execute these procedures under fire. That required large-scale training investments in both the Atlantic and Pacific, wet trainers that could simulate battle damage, and forward repair bases that could support damaged ships until they reached rear area yards. The doctrine existed. Now it had to be implemented across thousands of ships and hundreds of thousands of sailors. 1 January 1944. Pearl Harbor and forward areas, Pacific. At a damage control wet trainer, water blasted through a mock hatch, while sailors practiced rigging patches and portable pumps, reproducing patterns seen in the Solomons and North Pacific. The trainers were sophisticated. Flooded compartments with adjustable water flow, damaged piping that could be configured to simulate different casualty scenarios, and realistic equipment that matched what ships carried. Water sprayed through holes in bulkheads. Sailors wrestled with portable pumps in rising water, rigging discharge hoses while instructors timed them. The training was exhausting, cold, and as realistic as shore facilities could make it. Sailors learned that pumps were heavy, hoses were awkward, and power cables kinked at the worst moments. They learned these lessons in training rather than in combat. Early in the war, many crews had to improvise under fire, learning damage control while their ships were actually damaged. By 1944, the Navy expected most ships to arrive in combat with pre-trained, organized repair parties familiar with both the hardware and the doctrine. The difference in survivability was measurable. The Naval Damage Control Training Center and fleet schools systematized drills based on war damage reports. Each report from the Pacific became a training scenario. If Boise had flooded in a particular pattern, trainers replicated that pattern. If Salt Lake City's crews had found a particular pump rigging effective, that rigging became part of the curriculum. Combat experience fed directly into training with minimal delay. Forward bases at Espiritu Santo, Seidler Harbor, and Ulithi were equipped for structural repairs and pump maintenance, as described in structural repair studies. These were not rear area Navy yards. They were forward operating bases with floating dry docks, repair ships, and supply vessels positioned to support the fleet in the combat zone. A cruiser damaged off Guadalcanal could reach Espiritu Santo in days rather than steaming weeks to Pearl Harbor or California. Standard ship allowances now included multiple electric submersible pumps and gasoline salvage pumps. Training materials emphasized correct rigging, power distribution, and discharge routing. Sailors learned to calculate pump head, estimate discharge capacity, and troubleshoot electrical failures. They learned to work in teams with one sailor monitoring the pump, another managing the discharge, and a third ready to replace either if casualties occurred. Aircraft such as those from USS Onslow later reported seeing damaged cruisers and tugs surrounded by hoses, with all portable pumps available in operation on ships like Reno, Houston, and Canberra. This became standard practice. When a ship was hit, nearby vessels would cross-deck portable pumps and personnel to augment damage control efforts. Pumping capacity became a pooled resource, concentrated where it was most needed. A later Navy training document summarized the lesson. During World War II, many ships were saved because of the positive damage control practices. That sentence, written after the war, captured the essential point. Damage control was not luck or heroism alone. It was practice, doctrine, and equipment working together. By early 1944, doctrine, equipment, and training infrastructure were aligned. The remaining test was whether they would be enough to save heavily torpedoed cruisers in the upcoming Philippines campaign. In October 1944, when Houston and Canberra were hit off Formosa, the question was no longer whether portable pumps and cross-connected firemains worked, but whether there were enough of them on board. 14 through 16, October 1944, east of Formosa. Anti-aircraft guns on USS Houston engaged Japanese torpedo bombers during strikes against Task Force 38. Damage reports later recorded that a torpedo hit during the engagement flooded all 4 machinery spaces and disabled power. The ship went dark, dead in the water, listing and down by the stern. A single torpedo was expected to damage 1 or 2 spaces. Designers calculated blast effects, structural failure modes, and flooding rates based on single hits. Houston's case showed that hull attitude and hit location could produce flooding across all machinery compartments almost instantly. The torpedo struck in way of the forward engine room. Water rushed into the after boiler room through damaged piping. The forward fire room flooded through cable trunks and ventilation ducts. Within minutes, all 4 main machinery spaces were flooding or flooded. A first-person account published in U.S. Naval Institute proceedings recalled, "The after-boiler room and forward engine room flooded immediately." The language was matter-of-fact, but the implications were catastrophic. Without power, without propulsion, without main pumps, Houston was a floating hull kept alive only by auxiliary systems and portable equipment. The War Damage Report noted that the Damage Control Station ordered all portable submersible pumps to B-204L, and that repair parties rigged them through escape routes into the flooded engine room. This was aggressive damage control, sending pumps and personnel into spaces that were still flooding in a ship that was losing stability with Japanese air attacks continuing. With ship's main pumps lost, portable pumps and tugs assistance became the only way to control flooding and maintain stability during tow. Houston's crew rigged electric submersible pumps wherever they could find space and power. They ran discharge hoses topside, monitored water levels, and adjusted pump locations as the flooding stabilized. Gasoline-driven P500 pumps supplemented the electric units, providing capacity when electrical power was scarce. Destroyers came alongside to provide power through temporary cables. Tugs took Houston under tow, heading for Ulithi at slow speed. Repair parties worked continuously, shoring bulkheads, patching leaks, and keeping the pumps running. The tow took days. Every hour required vigilance and adjustment. Houston's official history recorded that after immediate flooding was contained and dewatering begun, she was eventually able to steam again with partial machinery restored, arriving in a floating dry dock for repairs. The dry dock at Seidler Harbor lifted her out of the water, exposing the torpedo damage, torn plating, crushed frames, and a hole large enough to drive a truck through. The Houston incident validated Bureau of Ships' push for larger portable pump allowances and confirmed that trained repair parties could re-enter flooded machinery spaces and stabilize ships once considered total losses. Houston was not supposed to survive. By pre-war standards, losing all machinery spaces meant abandoning ship. By 1944 standards, it meant aggressive damage, control, and a long tow to repair. At almost the same time, another cruiser, Canberra, suffered severe underwater damage in the same area. The two cases together would prove whether the new doctrine was robust or merely lucky. If Houston's survival was an outlier, a fortunate combination of circumstances, then the doctrine needed revision. If Canberra also survived, it would confirm that the system worked consistently. 13 through 20, October 1944. Western Pacific, Formosa to Ulithi. Heavy cruiser USS Canberra was torpedoed during the same series of air attacks that hit Houston. Damage control messages, logged by tugs and escorting vessels, recorded the progressive dewatering efforts over hundreds of miles of ocean. The torpedo hit in way of No. 4 fire room, flooding Numbers 3 and 4 fire rooms and Numbers 1 and 2 engine rooms. Canberra lost main power, propulsion, and most of her installed pumping capacity. Operational planners expected that heavily damaged cruisers would have to be abandoned or scuttled to prevent capture. The assumption was that ships without power and propulsion were liabilities, unable to defend themselves and vulnerable to follow-on attacks. Instead, Canberra and Houston became part of an ad hoc convoy of crippled ships, dewatered and stabilized in transit. Reports from USS Onslow describe flights over Reno, Houston, and Canberra, noting that all portable pumps available had been deployed on the damaged ships while they awaited or underwent tow. This was not standard procedure in the sense of being routine. It was standard in the sense that doctrine and training had prepared the fleet for exactly this situation. When ships were damaged, the fleet responded with coordinated damage control support. Tugs and repair ships contributed additional pumping capacity. Portable electric submersible pumps and gasoline handybillies from multiple hulls were cross-decked to the most threatened ships. Canberra received pumps from destroyers, from the tug, from Onslow when she came alongside. Pump capacity became a collective resource rather than an individual ship asset. Firemains were cross-connected and adductors supplied from surviving pumps, reflecting the doctrine laid down in the Handbook of Damage Control. Damage Control petty officers isolated ruptured sections, opened cross-connections, and routed water from functioning pumps to critical areas. The Firemain became a flexible network rather than a fixed system, adapted in real time to damage conditions. The structural repair study noted that despite a 10-inch shell hole and serious bottom damage over a 32-foot length on one cruiser, forward repairs and continuous pumping allowed safe passage to a floating dry dock. Temporary patches covered holes. Welded reinforcements strengthened damaged frames. Cofferdams isolated flooded spaces. All of this work was done at sea, under tow, with repair parties working in cramped and dangerous conditions. The salvage corridor from Formosa to Ulithi showed that standardized pumps, trained crews, and forward repair facilities could turn what would once have been permanent losses into temporary withdrawals. Ships that would have been scuttled in 1942 were saved in 1944. The difference was doctrine, equipment, and institutional knowledge. Canberra reached Ulithi and entered a floating dry dock for assessment and initial repairs. From there, she would transit to the United States for complete restoration. Her war damage report would recommend increased allowances of portable pumps and spare parts, linking recommendations directly to lessons from her own survival. Less than 3 weeks later, Reno would be struck off Luzon. Her survival would depend on applying all these lessons simultaneously under even more precarious conditions. 2 torpedoes instead of 1, greater flooding, longer tow distance, and fewer escorts to provide support. Reno would be the definitive test case. 3 November 1944, east of the San Bernardino Strait. Task Force. 38 steamed east of Luzon when USS Reno was torpedoed. Bureau of Ships' later report included stability curves, flooding diagrams, and a detailed pumping log spanning weeks. The report was 79 pages, one of the longest and most detailed cruiser case studies of the war. 2 torpedo detonations on a light cruiser, with power lost and extensive machinery space flooding, would normally be considered fatal. Destroyers and light cruisers were not as heavily subdivided as battleships or heavy cruisers. Their machinery spaces were more concentrated, their stability margins smaller. 2 torpedo hits, particularly hits that flooded machinery spaces, should have meant rapid loss. Reno remained afloat and was towed over 1,500 miles. The tow took weeks, interrupted by weather, by shifting flooding, and by the need to adjust stability repeatedly. A salvage party of 17 officers and 225 men remained aboard while the majority of the crew was removed. This skeleton crew kept the pumps running, monitored bulkheads, and adjusted ballast as conditions changed. The War Damage Report on Reno was one of the most detailed cruiser case studies used post-war as a teaching text for damage control officers. It included hour-by-hour pump logs, stability calculations for each stage of dewatering, and detailed recommendations for future design and equipment changes. The report stated that in addition to ships' pumps, survival depended on a group of portable electric submersible pumps and P500 gasoline-driven pumps, supplemented by the fleet tug's pumping capacity. The tug Zuni came alongside periodically to furnish additional capacity, cross-connecting hoses to Reno's system and running pumps directly into flooded spaces. Based on Reno and similar incidents, Bureau of Ships recommended that cruisers carry 8 electric submersible pumps and 4 P500 pumps, effectively codifying a new standard. This recommendation appeared in technical bulletins distributed fleet-wide. New construction incorporated these allowances into design specifications. Existing ships received additional pumps during overhaul periods. Firemain sections were isolated and cross-connected to ensure that surviving pumps could supply critical zones. Damage control petty officers on Reno executed the procedures exactly as the handbook described. Close valves to isolate ruptured sections, open cross-connections to route water around damage, verify pressure at critical points, and adjust as flooding boundaries shifted. The report's conclusion was categorical. The portable electric submersible pump has proved invaluable in controlling flooding in damaged ships. This was the summary judgment after analyzing Reno's survival in detail. Not helpful, not useful, invaluable. The pumps were the difference between survival and loss. Reno's survival provided quantitative proof that the combination of standardized portable pumps, doctrinal Firemain sectionalization, and trained damage control teams could keep a heavily damaged cruiser afloat through extended tow and repair. The data was comprehensive. Pump locations, discharge capacities, power consumption, hours of operation. Future officers could study Reno and understand exactly how her survival had been achieved. With Reno saved, Bureau of Ships could point to a chain of major combatants, Boise, Salt Lake City, Houston, Canberra, and others, whose survival depended on portable pumping and aggressive Firemain management, not on additional armor or guns. The statistical case was complete. Damage control worked. The question was what it meant in aggregate terms across the entire Pacific campaign. 1st August 1945. Bureau of Ships, Washington, D.C. As the Pacific War neared its end, Bureau of Ships compiled its series of 62 war damage reports, each summarizing causes, responses, and recommended design changes. The reports filled file cabinets, thousands of pages of technical analysis covering every major combat engagement from Pearl Harbor forward. Pre-war planning did not assume that so many ships could be returned to service after severe underwater damage. The calculations were conservative. A battleship might survive 1 or 2 torpedo hits, a cruiser perhaps 1, a destroyer none. Ships that exceeded these damage levels were expected to sink or be scuttled. Statistics now showed multiple cases where hulls once written off in theory were actually saved. The War Damage Report Series, the Destroyer Report on Torpedo and Mine Damage, and Structural Repair Monographs provided the aggregated quantitative record. These were not anecdotes or propaganda. They were engineering analyses with measurements, calculations, and recommendations. Each report documented what had failed, what had worked, and what needed to change. The Destroyer Report noted that portable electrical submersible pumps and 60-gallon-per-minute gasoline handy-billies were used in dewatering operations as standard practice prior to arrival of major salvage assets. This was the baseline. Every damaged destroyer used portable pumps. It was assumed, expected, and planned for. Across cruisers and destroyers, numerous cases attributed survivability directly to the availability and effective use of portable pumps and Firemain cross-connections. The reports quantified pump numbers, discharge capacities, and operating hours. They showed correlation between pump availability and survival rates. Ships with larger portable pump allowances survived damage that sank ships with smaller allowances. Later training literature would summarize, damage control is vital for survivability. During World War II, many ships were saved because of the positive damage control practices. This became the institutional memory, the lesson passed to new generations of officers and sailors. By correlating case histories with equipment allowances and organizational structures, Bureau of Ships demonstrated that investments in damage control, especially portable pumping and piping flexibility, had preserved dozens of major combatants and thousands of lives. The return on investment was measurable. Pumps cost thousands of dollars. Ships cost millions. Pumps paid for themselves many times over. The broader statistical picture showed that U.S. ships survived damage at rates significantly higher than Axis vessels. Japanese cruisers and destroyers, when torpedoed, typically sank. American cruisers and destroyers, when torpedoed, often survived. The difference was not armor or compartmentation. The difference was damage control doctrine, training, and equipment. The difference was portable pumps and the sailors who knew how to use them. This gave the U.S. Navy a force multiplier effect in the Pacific. American ships could sustain heavier combat because damaged ships returned to service rather than becoming permanent losses. Task forces could operate further from repair bases because forward repair capabilities could handle significant damage. The fleet could accept risks that would have been unacceptable under pre-war assumptions. The open question became how to preserve these hard-earned lessons in peacetime. Wars end, budgets shrink, and institutional memory fades. The danger was that the Navy would revert to pre-war assumptions, that portable pumps would be seen as unnecessary expense, that damage control training would be reduced to peacetime fire drills. Bureau of Ships worked to embed the lessons in permanent doctrine, making them part of the institutional structure rather than wartime expedients. 1945 through 1950. Naval Training Commands, United States. Post-war editions of NAVPERS 16191 and successor manuals were issued to new generations of officers and sailors. The preface still cited World War II experiences as their foundation. The handbook remained in print for years, with minor updates but no fundamental changes. The doctrine had been validated in combat. It did not need revision, only dissemination. Popular histories tended to emphasize battles, admirals, and new weapons. The public remembered Midway, Leyte Gulf, and the kamikaze attacks. They remembered names like Halsey and Nimitz. They remembered battleships and aircraft carriers. Training manuals and technical histories stressed something more prosaic: shoring timber, hoses, valves, and portable pumps. The Naval Damage Control Training Center and later surface warfare schools continued to teach World War II case studies as core material. New officers studied Reno, Houston, and Canberra. They learned to read war damage reports, to extract lessons, and to apply those lessons to new ship designs and operational concepts. The cases became canonical examples, referenced in every damage control course. Coast Guard and Navy training guides defined damage control as keeping afloat a badly damaged ship by procedures to limit flooding, stabilize the vessel, isolate fire, and explosions. This definition, drawn from wartime experience, became standard across all training programs. Damage control was not just firefighting, it was not just pumping, it was a comprehensive system for ship survival. Portable electric submersible pumps remained standard on warships. New models were developed with improved reliability, greater capacity, and better performance with contaminated water. But their purpose was unchanged from Reno and Houston. De-water flooded spaces when installed systems fail or are insufficient. The basic concept, a portable pump that could be rigged anywhere, powered by temporary cables, and operated by trained petty officers, remained constant. War damage reports were used in officer courses and staff colleges as examples of evidence-based design and doctrine. Students learned to analyze casualties, identify failure modes, and recommend changes. The analytical framework developed during World War II became the template for peacetime engineering and operational development. The handbook's introductory section still described itself as representing the accumulated damage control experiences of the present war, a reminder that every procedure in the book was paid for in steel and casualties. This framing kept the lessons grounded in reality. The doctrine was not theoretical. It was built on ships that sank and ships that survived, on sailors who died and sailors who lived. The institutionalization of damage control doctrine ensured that the actions of wartime mechanics and petty officers influenced ship design, training, and survivability for decades. The U.S. Navy entering the Cold War was fundamentally different from the Navy that entered World War II. The difference was not just new ships and weapons. It was a different understanding of survivability, built on portable pumps and flexible piping, and aggressive damage control. By mid-20th century, navies worldwide accepted that survivability depended not only on armor and armament, but on valves, pumps, and the people who operated them. The Pacific War's statistics showed that many U.S. ships owed their survival to cross-connected fire mains and portable pumps, a quiet but decisive advantage. By 1945, the survival of many Pacific warships depended less on their main batteries than on a few portable pumps, a sectionalized fire main, and the damage control petty officers who knew how to reroute every valve in the system. If you value carefully sourced, fact-based military history that examines how technology, doctrine, and human decisions shaped outcomes, consider supporting the channel so we can continue to analyze cases like these in depth.